Do you want to be forgotten forever? Do you want to die without a single achievement to your name? Of course you don't. So why are you still writing bad poetry? I have never met a writer who doesn't believe they'll be remembered after their death. Everybody, no matter how mediocre they are, everybody motivates themselves with dreams of posthumous glory. From the best-selling hack to the unpublished author on the periphery of things, they all think people will be reading their books forever. In the case of authors who are currently famous, they believe their fame will endure. And the unpublished authors are actually worse about this because they imagine that their continued failure is proof that they're Van Gogh or John Keats or something when they're not. In almost all of these cases, they're not good and they will be forgotten. Will I be forgotten? Of course. And I'm the only writer who will admit that. This video is longer than I intended it to be. I am continuing with the trend of my first video that involves covering a lot of groundwork that I think is important for writing poetry well. And so this video does not cover rhyme and meter or actually any specific rules of poetry, but I'm going to be talking about some valuable lessons and tips that can still help your poetry. I'm also going to be making some arguments for why you should cultivate a more high-minded style. Now in the past, this was something that never would have had to be defended, but we're not living in the past, we're living in the present, an era of decline. So there it is. Today I'm going to talk about a great writing tool. So you're writing and you're racking your brain for just the right word. You're having trouble thinking of it. So you do naturally what a lot of people do. You turn to a thesaurus. Amateur writers rely on this thing kind of heavily, and it's always evident when they do because they will use unusual words in the wrong context, and it's obvious they've been looking at a thesaurus. But when done well, this can be useful when you're looking for a different way to say something, or you don't want to be redundant. What if I told you, though, that there is a better alternative than just using your standard thesaurus? This is the historical thesaurus of the Oxford English Dictionary. It has almost every word in the entire history of the English language going back to Old English. That's almost 1 million words that have been used at some point over the last 1,000 years. It's a thesaurus on steroids. It took an entire team of scholars 40 years to complete this project. It's amazing. It's the first resource of its kind, the first historical thesaurus in any language. It came out in 2009. I know a lot of writers, and I don't know anybody who's actively using this, and most people have never even heard of it. It's an obscure scholarly thing, admittedly, but it's also amazing. It's probably the most useful word tool that I have used for my writing projects. And in general, it's great for beefing up your vocabulary. Here's the downside. It cost me $500, and probably you don't have that kind of money. But luckily for you, there is now a free online version of this. You can just Google historical thesaurus of English when it comes up, and you can click on it. I have it bookmarked, of course. So specifically, I'm focusing here on using this to write poetry, but it's useful for prose also. It's applicable to any form of imaginative writing. Now, obviously, you're writing in contemporary English, so you don't need to use words from Old or Middle English, unless you're writing in a specific genre of poetry, like historical poetry about characters who lived centuries ago. If you're doing this, you do need to acquaint yourself with the vocabulary of that time period and sprinkle words in your writing. Not a lot, you don't want to go over people's heads, but just throw in an occasional word to give the flavor of the period. And this resource helps you to do that in an easy way because all of the words have a range of dates associated with them, from when a word was first used in print to when it fell out of common usage. Another niche category of poetry this is useful for is nonsense poetry. If you're making up words like Lewis Carroll did in Jabberwocky, you can actually use this to do that really well. Find a bizarre word, rearrange a few letters, or combine a few words to form a portmanteau. Or take an extinct, obscure word that has long fallen out of the spoken vocabulary and just use it in a new way. But we're not doing any of those things here. We're not writing a historical poem or a nonsense poem, just a regular poem. But what's interesting about the historical thesaurus that's useful for this is when you get into modern times, there's a lot of fun slang words and informal words for things that you're just not going to get by doing a Google search for basic synonyms or using a more basic thesaurus. So let's keep it simple. Maybe you want to come up with an image of love. So let's see what the historical thesaurus says if we type in heart. So because it's a very common word, you get a lot of different categories and subcategories of semantics, of meaning. At the top you have the body, literally just the physical heart, the thing that's in your chest cavity. But we're going for a metaphor here, so we need something less literal. And here's where you have to think about specific shades of meaning. But again, we're using heart as a descriptor for love. So I'm just going to use the search function because I don't feel like going through every category. So we type love, and look, we actually get 5 different categories. It's never as simple as you think it is. Let's go with amorous love, seat of love. So we click on this, and we see that the seat of love is the heart. And we also get liver. Well, it was common to associate feelings of love with the liver in the Middle Ages, but we don't think about the liver in that way anymore, unless maybe you're an alcoholic in love. And this is just one example of how, if you're just browsing this website and have a sliver of imagination, you'll get a lot of really interesting ideas. Often the best discoveries, whether scientific or artistic, come while you're just tinkering around with things, experimenting. But anyway, we're looking for another synonym for heart, not liver. Still looking the heart as a descriptive for love, but we can see that the heart is not just the seat of love, but it's the seat of courage, of feelings generally, of will, even of morality, of conscience. You could write a poem about this, about all the different meanings of the heart. And this resource really shows you the way a word is interconnected with all its various connotations. So let's look at just the general category for the noun love. You see a lot of interesting words for every type of love in existence. Overlover, votary, there's a good one. A devotee of love is a votary of love. And we see that in this category of the seat of the affections, heart is actually the only word listed. So let's go back and hit terms of endearment. You don't want to use heart or sweetheart, that's boring. Honeycomb, still a bit cliche. Ladybird, that's better. There's just a ton of words in this category. You get a lot of slang terms. Pussums, I like that. If your word doesn't have an end date after the dash, it means it's still in use, whereas if it does, then it's an archaic word. I'm not saying just blindly plug weird words into your poems, but just because you're not going to use all of these words in their direct form doesn't mean they still can't be useful to you. Tolkien invented all of the names for places and characters in Middle-earth by studying medieval languages. Mordor, Morgoth, Sauron, Saruman. There's a lot of family resemblances between some of these names, and that's because he was using common root words for them. And these names all have deep meanings. Sauron means the abhorred or the abominable in Elvish, for example. Now, you're probably not going to invent your own language, but you should still understand the roots of English, because it'll make you a better poet. Once you find an interesting word in the historical thesaurus, you may have to look up its specific shade of meaning in the Oxford English Dictionary to make sure you're not using it out of context. And you can also do this easily on the online OED, which is the companion website to this one. I also have a physical copy of the OED, by the way, very useful. The poet W.H. Auden was a big reader of the OED. He had a complete set, and this was before it was available in the 2-volume edition, so it took up a lot of space, and he would often break out a volume at dinner time so he could chew on words with his food. He even once said that if he was marooned on a desert island, he would rather have a good dictionary than a great literary masterpiece, because the dictionary can be read an infinite number of ways, while a novel can only be read one way. Great poets have an affinity for linguistic creativity. The wider your range of vocabulary, the more you can play around with words, invent new words, recombine old words. Shakespeare and Milton were both great at this. Paradise Lost is full of coinages. And if you're saying, oh, Paradise Lost, it's so difficult to read, I hate it. Yeah, well, that's why it's still read today. Because it's a sophisticated work of literature, and there's a necessary level of difficulty that comes with that. Now, there are poets who had simpler styles. Rumi, for example, is very popular today, and he lived 800 years ago. So I'm not saying that if you're not trying to craft an intricately complex literary work, then you'll necessarily be forgotten. But you need to keep this in mind too. There are more authors alive today than there ever have been in the past, and the simpler your style, the more difficult it's going to be to distinguish you from other writers of our time. Look at Instapoets. Remove their names from their poems and you won't be able to tell them apart. This is undoubtedly a major reason why Ruby Kaur and other Instapoets are always getting accused of plagiarism. You don't want to be indistinguishable. The best way to stand out is to increase the complexity of your work. Nobody ever accused Johann Sebastian Bach of plagiarizing his compositions, and that's because nobody else was writing like Bach. Now, in my last tutorial video, Secrets of Crafting Timeless Poetry, I said you want to keep your style simple and natural. And it seems like I'm contradicting myself here with advice to scale up your complexity. I'm not trying to confuse you, just let me explain. Generally, simplicity is your friend, and what I mean by this is don't use unnecessary words when they're not called for. But this simplicity rule is also something that you just kind of tell beginners, like you want to walk before you can run. Milton was cultivating an epic style, and that kind of writing is much more high flown and baroque. The language is very sublime and grandiose. Edmund Spenser, author of The Faerie Queene, looked to Middle English for inspiration, but he was writing a poem about knights in the Middle Ages, so that was an appropriate style for him. And you want to find the style that is appropriate for the type of poetry and genre you're trying to write. If you're writing poems about everyday life in 2024, you're not going to cultivate an epic, sublime style. And I would say that even if you have grand ambitions, you should start small. All of the great epic poets who were actual historical persons, like not Homer, but everybody else, they started off small. They started off mastering lyric poetry before they moved to epic. So it's essential to lay your foundation. You can write something complex that seems simple and natural. And my example here again is Tolkien. He invented this language and all these words, but it occurs in his fantasy world in a way that unfolds naturally, so you're not really conscious of it. I would also add that while a lot of people don't like poetry, they tolerate it in Tolkien because the poems are sandwiched between prose. In fact, I read a claim that he's actually the most widely read poet of the century for that reason. Tolkien once used a great metaphor to describe this process, where he likened crafting a story to making a cauldron of soup. Essentially, he said that while the cook has to be aware of all the different ingredients that go into the cauldron and how they interact to shape the overall taste, the reader just wants to eat the tasty soup. So, as a writer, you have to find a way to hide the ingredients in your soup to make them palatable. Now, Milton admittedly doesn't really do this, right? Reading Paradise Lost is maybe a little bit like having the cauldron of soup just like dumped on you instead of eating it. And this is why when you're reading Milton, you really need to read a copy with footnotes. Anyway, I hope you get the idea here. I know that reading a big dictionary or thesaurus is probably not your idea of fun. But if you're a poet or a writer more generally, I would encourage you to go beyond the very simple minimalistic style that everybody else is doing today. W.H. Auden would have killed to be able to sit down with the historical thesaurus of the OED at dinner time with his Oxford fellows and nerd out. But this isn't something that was available to him. It is available to you. So why not use some of the amazing verbal tools at your disposal? This is a more learned approach, but when you're read in the future and those other authors aren't, you might thank me. Except you actually won't because, well, you'll be dead. But tell your descendants to thank me. Now, something I encounter that's very common is that people undertake literary projects without first mastering the basic elements of writing. They're bad at grammar, they don't know figures of speech, their metaphor making is clumsy. With the audiobook revolution, it seems like a lot of people are listening to audiobooks now more than they physically read, and this is a good supplement to your studies, but listening to audiobooks is not enough. You need to be reading physical books and staring at the words. There's something you get out of looking at the page that you don't get from just hearing the words go through your head. I am always reading manuscripts where the novelist or poet or whoever hasn't mastered their basic elements. It's a huge headache when you're editing a manuscript riddled with grammar errors that the writer should know about, but doesn't. So I'd recommend reading a basic writing book like Elements of Style by William Strunk and E.B. White, the author more famously known for writing Charlotte's Web. The fourth edition is only about 100 pages long. Let's talk about punctuation. Now, in contemporary poetry, there is heavy pressure to just not use any punctuation at all, and one side effect of this minimalism is that people are no longer familiar with the subtleties of different punctuation marks, the difference between the comma and the semicolon, the colon and the em dash or long dash, and parentheses. Like, when should you use a parenthetical aside, and when should an aside be set off by two em dashes instead? Or when should you use an em dash instead of a colon, or a semicolon instead of a comma? A lot of aspiring authors don't understand these distinctions very well. Now, I've said before that the reasons behind minimalism are sometimes given to be political, like it promotes social equality. While I don't doubt that these writers believe this, I think that's ultimately a rationalization. When Hemingway and William Carlos Williams began popularizing minimalism, there were no political reasons behind it. The real cause, I think, is just declining literacy. People aren't using complex punctuation because they don't know how. They inherited a growing literary trend from an earlier generation writing, and they use a political rationalization as an excuse for their incompetence. Most of the time, not all of the time. Now, one master poet who bucks this trend and does use complex punctuation to really brilliant effect is James Sale. A single sentence from his epic, The English Cantos, might contain a combination of colons, dashes, and semicolons, like you see here. This is very advanced and obviously takes a lot of skill. It sets him apart from the morass of other writers out there today. The long dash in particular is an extremely versatile mark. As Strunk and White explain, it sets off an abrupt break or interruption in a way that is stronger than a colon, but more relaxed than parentheses. I use dashes a lot in my own verse. Some people don't like Strunk and White because they interpret all grammar advice as commands that you need to follow to the letter all the time, but this isn't the case. Every rule is just a rule of thumb. And it's kind of like that old Buddhist parable that says something along the lines of, you use the raft to cross the river, and then after you've crossed the river, you discard the raft. So, you use the rules, but you can break them for specific purposes if you know what you're doing. If you don't obtain a thorough understanding of sentence structure when you're writing poems using a strict meter like iambic pentameter, it's going to be harder to avoid the temptation to make syntactical inversions, that is, rearranging your word order in an awkward way to fit the meter, or to foist a particular end rhyme in place. These types of inversions are a very common problem I encounter when I read poetry manuscripts from amateur formal poets. Now I'm going to suggest something else that is obvious. Stop watching TV so much. I know it's hypocritical because I'm talking into a screen right now and you're staring at the screen. Screens are a part of life today. Authors have to be on social media platforms. But you need to get off the screen and onto the page. The most common problem I find among aspiring writers is not a lack of talent. It's a lack of discipline. And living in a culture where screens are everywhere makes it hard to cultivate that discipline. If television is a major problem for you, just remove the temptation and get rid of it, like I did. This is the complete opposite of the trendy, fun thing involving going to coffee shops and hanging out with cool people reciting spoken word poetry. I'm basically telling you to not do that. I'm saying sit in a room reading big, boring books. And if you're a young person, the former option is a lot more tempting. Most of the people I know writing classical poetry are older. Often they'll have been writing free verse for years before they finally conclude it's a dead end and turn to formal verse. So it's difficult to convince young people to take this road, which is by far the road less traveled, especially when none of their peers are. Going to a poetry slam event is like being at a party. It's very exciting. And being a classical poet is like being the lonely curmudgeon in the empty library, and you're looking out the window at the people having fun, and you're feeling all left out. Nobody wants to miss out on life. You want to be where the action is, and I understand this. I'm not saying just sit in libraries all the time and never have a social life, but being a classical poet is not for the faint of heart. It does involve sacrifice in terms of effort, time commitment, becoming knowledgeable in subjects. Not just the subject of poetry, but I would say really things about history and philosophy. Poetry is in many ways the first discipline. Epic poems like Gilgamesh and the Iliad precede the development of science. They precede the development of philosophy and everything that comes after that. Poetry is inclusive of all these things, though. You can incorporate history and philosophy into your poetry in a way that really enriches it. And that's why I also say don't limit yourself to the narrow presentism that is so in vogue today. And by taking this route, it may alienate you from people who have nice democratic opinions about not negatively judging anybody's work as inferior. But here's the thing about exercising critical judgment. It isn't nice, but judging people is how you have standards for things. It's how you have moral standards in social life and society. And in art, it's how you have aesthetic standards. All art is not created equal. There are hierarchies of quality. Tupac was a great rapper, and the Beatles were great rock musicians, but if you think they're as good as Johann Sebastian Bach, you're out of your mind. And it seems like Americans have a particularly hard time accepting this, which is why free verse poetry as it developed in America with Walt Whitman is very different from European free verse poetry that was pioneered by Friedrich Hölderlin. In America, we have this idea that everything and everybody has to be equal, and equality of opportunity is certainly an idea that was essential to our founding, but this idea should not apply to art. Whitman-esque free verse is just spontaneously scribbling down whatever comes comes into your head and thinking it's just as good as everything else. And you need to throw off this idea. That means undoing a lot of conditioning you have received over the years. Alexis de Tocqueville thought that America would never produce great art because it's too democratic. Everyone is too practical and utilitarian and egalitarian. Contrast this with aristocratic ages, where they're very unequal, but artists have patronage and don't have to worry about practical problems or being relatable. They can just focus on achieving greatness and originality. And being employed as a court poet or musician, they had a discerning audience ready at hand. Now, Tocqueville was technically wrong. There is great art here, but I think he was correct in spirit. In the literary world, American figures have by and large arisen by accident and had to struggle a lot in their lives. Many of them felt out of place with the tenor of their times, and so they'd often turn to alcohol to cope with this. A disproportionate number of great American authors have been alcoholics. Now, fast forward to today, this impulse towards equality is now taken to an extreme by the literary establishment in a way that I would argue is actually un-American and not like it was in the past. It actually more closely resembles the literary scene in the USSR that Vladimir Nabokov satirizes at the beginning of his lectures on Russian literature. So, he wrote this very funny essay where he describes the typical plot of a state-sanctioned Russian novel and like what you had to do to pass the censors, and what you had to do is basically espouse the party creed in a sentimental and monotonous way. You have the virtuous protagonist who is a champion of the working class, and the plot takes place on a model farm or factory or mine. And then you have the antagonist, a saboteur, tampering with the plans of the Soviet undertaking. And often this would take the form of a crime novel where the saboteur must be rooted out. And then you have the happy ending with the triumph of the state in the form of the working class hero. And just replace working class hero with, trans person of color or some other character of intersectional status. And Soviet literature is basically more or less the same as the puritanical stuff being pushed by the mainstream literary establishment in America today. It's proletarian literature. I have a friend, a former academic, who told me a story about an English professor he knows at the University of Colorado who is teaching her students to scan texts for their diversity content. Are there any characters who are BIPOC or LGBTQ or some other acronym? And if yes, are these characters portrayed in a positive light? If the answer to either of these questions is no, then the book is judged inadequate. Now, my friend, being of liberal inclination but not a maniac, confided to me that he was disturbed by what this radical professor was teaching her students. And he should be, because what that English professor was teaching was no mere academic exercise. This is training to enter the corporate world. This is exactly how a lot of employees in the big publishing companies today operate. They are essentially like the Soviet censors. And this is not a fringe thing. This is mainstream. Why is it that good art in socialist countries is virtually non-existent? Except in cases like Boris Pasternak or Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who were butting heads with the regime. It's because in those countries, the artist is not allowed to write freely. You have to toe the party line, cheer on the dogma. A lot of people will say, hey, those romantic poets, they were great, weren't they? Such passion, such beauty in their verse. Let's revive romanticism. So occasionally you have people who will be called romantic or neo-romantic poets, even though they lived in the 20th century or are living now. My own style has been referred to by this term. But nobody ever says, hey, what happened to Soviet realism? Or, remember all that great literature produced during Mao's Cultural Revolution? Let's bring that back. Nobody says that. Communist countries do not produce quality writers, and the literary establishment today in America is also not favoring quality writers in the MFA programs in publishing anywhere. So the point of this digression is to make an argument for the case that if you're a real artist, that means having standards. Don't buckle to mediocrity. Don't praise stuff that isn't good. I would advise, for the most part, to avoid hanging around people and writers who are going to drag you down, and rather try to spend time with those and mentor under those who are going to help you improve your craft. In the same way that hanging around meth addicts and alcoholics is probably going to be a bad influence on you, hanging around degenerate free verse poets at poetry workshops is also not going to help you. It's going to have a negative effect on your literary style and development. It's best to try to find a writing community full of people who share your values and your high standards. This is probably going to be online because, I don't really know of any coffee shops where like formalist poets are hanging out. But that would be nice if we could have some of those. And maybe we will in the future. As I've said, aim for beauty, aim for greatness, and that means doing a lot of hard, boring groundwork. When you're studying math or science, are you sitting around having Socratic discussions, expressing your opinions on parabolas or the periodic table? No, you're memorizing a lot of stuff, you're doing exercises to apply principles. It's not fun. Nobody signs up for calculus with the expectation that it's going to be fun. And yet, if you take an art or literature class or poetry workshop, there is that expectation. And yes, you're reading entertaining stories, but you have to work at the basics too, so you can appreciate, Paradise Lost if you're even reading that. Since we're not living in a time where students are taught literature in this rigorous way, you have to do it yourself. You have to be your own disciplinarian. And that's why I say read the dictionary and thesaurus for vocabulary, grammar books for basic writing tips. Don't let yourself off with the excuse that you don't have time. If you don't have time for this, you shouldn't have time to write a novel or a long poem. I am not doing these tutorials for you to become some willy-nilly poet just expressing yourself. That's what most poetry teachers do today. You're not going to create anything valuable that way. I want you to be a literary genius. Now, obviously, there's some natural talent and imagination that has to come along with that. But the thing about geniuses is, and here I'm remembering something I once read in a Steven Pinker book, I'm quoting him here, geniuses are wonks. Mozart is the pinnacle of genius in music, right? He was a child prodigy. He was a great natural talent. Yes. But here's the thing. He started composing when he was like 5, but he didn't actually write his first masterpiece until he was 18. Now that's a long time to be writing mediocre stuff, but that's an average period of development. You have to practice your craft for a long time and apprentice under masters before you yourself are a master. Child prodigies just have a 20-year head start on everybody else, and parents who are nurturing them and pushing them. So if working hard at poetry is something you're prepared to undertake, I am willing to help guide you to the best of my ability. So if you have specific suggestions or questions about this and where to go, reach out and leave a comment. And if you do pursue this route, I can't promise anything, but in the long run, I think it will work out better for establishing your legacy as an author. Before I go, one last thing. Since I didn't have any tips specific to poetry, I will say one here. I'm taking this again from James Sale's Poetry Circle newsletter, which I discussed in my first video, and also have a link to in the description of this video. Last time I cited his 13th rule, aim for beauty, and this time I'm going to cite his first rule. I'm jumping around a lot here. And his first rule is write bad poetry. Now I know I started this video asking, why are you still writing bad poetry? And while you don't want to do this forever, this is not the end goal. You will inevitably write bad poetry when you start out, if you're not doing so already. I wrote bad poetry for years, everybody does it. Everybody begins in mediocrity. Even Shakespeare's first few plays weren't that great. Titus Andronicus is completely over the top. You need to be practicing writing, and that involves writing stuff that's mostly bad, so don't be afraid to write a lot of bad poetry, using the writing tools I've described here, of course. But I would caution you to maybe not try to publish this poetry that's bad, because if you look back on this in the future, you're probably going to look at that early juvenilia and wince, and you'll want to destroy it, but it can't be destroyed because it's already out there in the open. So write on, friends, and with that, I will leave you and say, until next time.